Hello everyone and welcome to another BlenderMadeEasy tutorial. Today we're going to be creating this missile explosion effect. To do this we're going to be using a particle system, dynamic paint, and two different smoke and fire simulations. Let's go ahead and get started by deleting the default cube and press Shift A. We'll add in a UV sphere. This is going to be what we use to emit the particles. Let's scale it down a little bit and move it over about 5 grid units to the left. Next up, for the actual missile, we're going to be using a model that I created, or you can go ahead and create your own. If you want to use the one I made, the link is in the description. Once you have it downloaded, go over to File, down to Append, and then navigate to where that blend file is. Go ahead and select it, go over to Collection, and then add in the missile collection. We're going to drag it over to the left over here, just so it's out of the way. And then to create the particle system, select your UV sphere, go over to the Particle System tab, and create a new one. The number of particles is way too many, so let's bring it down to a value of about 20. If you want more missiles, bring this value up. If you want less, just bring it down. For the start and end frame, we're going to set the end frame to 150, so over 150 frames, 20 missiles will be emitted. As for the other settings, we're going to open up the velocity tab, set the normal amount to 2, and then for the Z, we're going to set that all the way up to 17. So now this is what it looks like. All of the particles are moving up really quickly. To actually get the missile to show up as the particle, we're going to open up the render tab, switch it from render as halo to render as object. And then for the instant object, of course, select the missile over here. The other thing I want to do is also randomize the movement of this. So over in the velocity tab, once again, we're going to set the random up to 4. And then for the scale of this, we're going to go up to 0.3, so they're a little bit bigger. That is looking pretty good, and now we can see this is what it looks like. But they are not moving over here. To actually get them to go up and then move over to this direction, we need to add in a force field. So go over to the force field and then add in a force. We're going to drag this about 5 grid units to the right, and then over in the physics panel, we're going to set up a couple of different settings. First off, the strength is set to a positive value. That means the particles are going to move away from the force field. If we instead set this to a negative value like -40 for example, now what's going to happen is the particles are going to move towards this object. That is looking pretty good, but to give it a little bit more structure so they actually come to this point, we need to set the flow amount to a value of 2. Now what's going to happen is this. That's looking a little bit better, so let's give it some randomness as well by setting the noise amount up to 0.3. One other issue that you might notice is that the missiles are not rotating as they come up and around. They're just rotated along the X direction like this. To fix that, we can go over to the particle system, open up the rotation by checking that box, and then turning on dynamic. Now when we restart and play it, the particles will rotate based on the direction that they're heading. And we can see here this is looking a lot better. The other thing I want to do is delete these particles right when they hit this point. This will make it look like they actually explode. To do this, we need to add in a mesh and then a plane object. Scale this plane up just a little bit and then move it over to right where the force field is. Then head over to the physics panel, give it collision, and then we have an option to kill the particles right when they touch this point. So make sure that is enabled. So now what happens is when we play it, the particles will disappear right when they hit that spot. You want to make sure that the plane is big enough that the particles are not hitting like over here or right on the edge. Make sure they're somewhere in the middle. With that done, we can go ahead and select our particle system and then go over to the cache settings, and then we can bake this in. So if you're happy with all the other settings, go ahead and click on bake. Now let's create the dynamic paint simulation. This is used for the smoke simulation later because it's going to allow us to control where the explosion happens based on the position of these particles when they hit this plane. So to do this, we're going to use this object here. We're going to go over to the physics panel. We can go ahead and get rid of the collision. We're not going to need that anymore since we baked it in. Then we're going to add in a dynamic paint. We're going to leave the type on canvas and then add this in. The end frame will set over to 200. And then for the subframes, we're going to go all the way up to, can we go up to 20? Yes, we're going to go all the way up to a value of 20. For the surface type, we're going to switch it over to weight. Then we also want to make sure dissolve is checked. We're going to set the time of when it dissolves to 15. Make sure you open up the output as well and create a plus sign right there to make sure that the information goes over to the vertex group. Jumping over to the particle system, go ahead and select dynamic paint, switch the type over to brush, and then add in a brush. We're going to switch it over from mesh volume over to particle system, and then of course select the particle system. For the effect radius, we're going to go up to a value of 0.4. So now what's going to happen is when the particles emit and come over here, they're going to leave a spot where we can use the fire simulation to emit right where that particle disappears. We also want to make sure this plane is moved up just slightly, so when the particle hits it, it'll actually create it and not get deleted. So if we move it up slightly, it'll get deleted right below this plane. Right about there is pretty good. With that done, we can go over to the cache settings, and currently it's grayed out, so we need to make sure we save our project. After you have saved your project, you can see these settings appear, and we are ready to bake it in. Another very important thing before we bake this in is we need to add a lot more geometry to our plane. Right now, if we go into edit mode, we can see there's only 4 vertices. This does not work for the vertex groups, so with everything selected in edit mode, we're going to right click and subdivide this. If we open up this panel, we're going to set the number of cuts to 100, and that should be pretty good. With that done, let's save our project once again and then click on bake. To actually see if this is working properly, we can come over here and switch it over to the weight paint mode and then player animation. We can see it is working and the spots are being created. And speaking of dynamic paint, I wanted to let you guys know that I actually have an entire class on this topic. It's called The Complete Guide to Dynamic Paint in Blender. It goes into detail on the simulation and everything you need to know on how to start using it. There are paint effects, displacement animations, dynamic paint using the fire simulation, and creating raindrops. This class has it all. By the end, you will have a really good understanding of dynamic paint and how to use it effectively. I'm really happy with how this class turned out, and I think you guys will really like it. And since Skillshare is sponsoring this video, you can actually view this class and thousands of others for free for an entire month. If you didn't know, Skillshare is an online platform where you have unlimited access to learn whatever you want at any time. I've been using it for years now and I absolutely love it. They have classes on Blender, Photoshop, VFX, video editing, just to name a few. Now is the perfect time to invest in yourself. With the Skillshare membership, you can improve your skills in Blender, engage in new hobbies, and finally stick to that New Year's resolution that you keep mentioning every year but don't keep up with. The first 1,000 people to click the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. And while you're over there, make sure to check out my 9 other classes as well. Thanks again to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the tutorial. Alright, now that we've set up our scene, let's create the explosion. We're going to add in a new cube to be the domain for this explosion over here. We'll go into the front view, scale it up, and position it right about here. Then over in the physics panel, we're going to enable fluid, set the type over to domain, and then we're going to leave it on gas. As for the resolution divisions, we're going to go up to 128. And then for the time scale, I noticed that this simulation tends to look pretty fast, so we're going to go down to a value of 0.6. For the border collisions, we're going to enable the bottom right here, and then enable adaptive domain as well. We're also going to enable noise to add in some extra detail to our simulation. And then for the upres factor, we're going to leave it at 2. The strength, let's go down to a value of about 0.5. Also for the vorticity, let's go up to 0.1 just to give the smoke a little bit more randomness. Another important thing is over in the field weights, we need to make sure the force value right here is down to 0. This means that the force field that we've added earlier will not affect the simulation. Make sure that's down to 0 and you should be good. We're going to set it over to the all so it bakes everything all at once, and just in case I want to stop the bake, I'm going to click on its resumable. And with that done, let's go over to our object right here. This is going to be our inflow object. Select fluid and set the type over to flow. As for the flow type, we're going to go fire and smoke, and the flow behavior, we're going to set it over to inflow. For the vertex group, select the one that we created using the dynamic paint. So now what's going to happen is every time the missile collides here and creates a vertex, it's going to emit fire right at that location. For the flow source, we need to make sure isPlanar is checked and then enable initial velocity. For the Z, we're going to go up to a value of 10. This will make it look like the fire is going up very quickly right when the missile explodes. And with that done, let's bake it in. Let's come over here to the cache settings right here, save your project once again, set the end frame to 200, and then click on bake. Once this is done, we'll work on the particle system. Alright, the simulation has finished baking, so let's go ahead and check it out. As you can see, right when the particles hit the plane, it creates an explosion. And that looks pretty cool. All right, there we go. So now that we've created this smoke simulation, let's work on the actual missiles themselves. Let's add in a new cube. This is going to be a new domain object. We're going to scale it up. And the reason we are using two different domain objects with two different simulations is because we're going to be using different settings for the smoke in the missiles. And also another reason is that it just works a lot better. A lot of the times when I would try to add noise to the trail of the smoke, whenever I had the explosion and the particles in the same domain, it would create this very weird separation between the different frames, and it just didn't really look good at all. So that is why we are using two different simulations. So we're going to scale this up, scale it along the X so it fits the entire scene, and then you want to play through it and make sure that all of the particles are still inside the domain object. So I'm going to scroll through here and we can see one of them actually exits. So I'm going to go into edit mode and just drag this part up a little bit until it matches the height. So we'll scroll through here a little bit more, and I think that is pretty good. And then what we can do is also go into side view and make sure none of the particles leave, and it looks pretty good that way as well. So we are ready to create the simulation. So with this object selected, we're going to enable fluid, set the type over to domain, and then also make sure you press Ctrl A and apply the scale. Next up, we'll select one of the missiles, create a fluid right here, set the type over to flow, and then for the flow type, we're going to set it over to fire and smoke, and then of course, we're going to switch it over to inflow. As for the sampling, since these objects are moving very quickly, let's go up to a value of 50 for the sampling. For the flow source, we're going to switch it over to particle system, and then for the particle system, select the one that we've created. For the size, we're actually going to go higher. Let's go up to a value of 1.5. And that's basically all we really need to do for these settings over here. One thing to keep in mind is the fire is going to emit wherever the origin point on your object is. So we can see my object's origin point is at the bottom, so the fire is going to emit right there. But for example, if this was down and the origin point was in the middle, the fire simulation would start right there. So make sure if you created your own simulation that the origin point is right on the bottom of the missile, or it's going to look a little bit weird. As for the domain object, let's go ahead and select it again. We're going to set the resolution divisions up to a value of 200. Then we're going to come down here, turn on adaptive domain and dissolve. As for the time for the dissolve, we're going to go up to 15 frames. Make sure slow is enabled as well, and then also we're going to check on noise. The strength of this will go down to a value of about 0.8. And then of course in the field weights, make sure the force is set down to 0 so the force field does not affect the simulation either. And another thing that we need to do is make sure this flow object does not affect this domain. Because right now, since it's inside this domain, it's actually going to emit more fire, and that's not what we want. We only want the missiles to emit the smoke and fire. So to fix that, we can open up the collections tab right here and set a different collection for the flows. So what I'm going to do is select both the particle system and the domain, press M and move them to their own collection. I'm going to call it particles. Then with the domain selected, we're going to open up the collections tab right here, and underneath the flow, we're going to select the particles. So now only the flow object inside this collection, which is this object here, is going to emit smoke and fire into the scene, and not this object over here. And with that done, we can also open up the fire tab. We're going to set the vorticity of the flames up a little bit so it's a bit more random. We'll set that to 0.7. The vorticity of the smoke, we will also set up to 0.7. Switch the type over to all, and then turn on is resumable, and then we can bake this in. Also the end frame, make sure that is set to 200. One thing that I had forgotten to mention is you also want to make sure that you set a new directory for the cache, because right now it might overwrite the other simulation, so make sure to click on this button here and set it to a different folder. With that done, let's click on bake. Alright, the simulation has finished baking, and here is our result. As you can see, it looks pretty cool. We have the missiles and they have fire and smoke being emitted, and they're creating an explosion over here. So the next thing on our list is to create the materials for both the explosion and the smoke trails. To do this, we can come over to the shading workspace. We're going to create a new material with the big cube selected. We're going to delete the principled shader, we're not going to need it, and then add in a shader and then a principled volume shader right here. Take the volume and plug it into the volume of the material output. Now before we do anything else, let's set up some EV settings so we can actually see what the smoke is going to look like. So jump over to the EV settings right here. We're going to turn on screen space reflections, open up the volumetrics, set the tile size down to 2 pixels, and then turn on volumetric shadows. We can still see our smoke is not looking that great, so another thing that we can do is set the end frame a lot lower. Basically how Eevee renders fire is it splits up the different layers over 100 and 100 meters. So right now we're not getting that many layers in our smoke. If we bring this down to, let's say, about 15, we should get a lot more detail. If we bring up the density now, we can see the fire a lot better. We can also bring up the sampling, so let's bring up this to 128, and then the samples for the shadows, let's also bring that to 32. This is just going to give us a lot better results. As for the other nodes that we're going to be adding, we're first going to add in a input and then a volume info node, and we'll place it over here. We're going to be taking the density and the flame attribute and adding them into the principled volume. Firstly, let's add in a color ramp. We'll place it here. We'll take the density, plug it into the factor, then the color into the density of the principled volume. To control the density a bit more, we're going to add in a math node and set it over to multiply. Now this bottom value controls how dense the smoke is going to be. Let's set this all the way up to 100. Over here, we're going to bring this white handle a lot closer to the black handle, and this will clamp down on all of the smoke and make it look a lot more dense. We're also going to add in another handle. This is going to be on the far right side, and this is going to be set down to a black color. Now you can see that inside the smoke, it has actually disappeared. This will allow the fire to actually pop a lot more when we add it in. To add in the fire, let's press Shift D on this color ramp. We'll place it down here. We'll take the flame attribute, plug it into the factor, then the color is going to go into the emission strength. We're going to select this multiply node, Shift D it, and place it over here. And then this bottom value we're also going to leave at 100. What we can do now is bring this way a little bit, and we can see there it's updated now. And then we're also going to bring this value closer to the right to clamp down on the fire. If you want it to be a shorter flame, drag this even further to the right. If you want it longer, just drag it to the left. Somewhere around here should be pretty good. Now to control the color of this, we're going to select this color ramp, Control Shift D to duplicate it, and this will keep the connection to the flame. We're going to take the color and plug it into the emission color. Now for the values down here, we're going to select the far right handle. This is going to be a nice yellowish color, somewhere around here. Then for this white handle in the middle, this is going to be more of a darker orange color. Something like that will look pretty nice. Then just play with the position and the colors and you should get something that looks really cool. For the material for the other object, we're going to come over here, select the domain, select the drop down menu, and select the material that we just created, which is this material here, material 001. We can see that's added it to our scene. Let's also duplicate this so we can change it ourselves. And what we're going to be doing is selecting this handle. We're going to get rid of that. We don't need that black handle. We'll drag this a little bit closer to give our smoke more dense look. And then I also don't want to clamp down on the fire, so I'm going to drag the black handle closer to the left. That will add more fire to our scene. And then also down here, I'm going to bring this closer, drag that to the left, and just add a little bit more color into our fire. That should look pretty nice. Let's jump back over to our layout and then add in an object to be the ground floor. I'm going to add in another plane. We're going to scale this plane up, go into front view, and just drag it up so it's sitting right beneath the fire, right about there is good. Then for the lighting, I'm going to select my lamp in the scene, jump over to the lamp settings, and set it over to a sun lamp. The strength of this we'll play around with. Let's try a value of 2 for now. And we can see that actually looks pretty good. From here, you can just rotate it and place it however you like, and then add in the camera and position it and then render it out. You can see here, since I positioned my camera 15 meters past the smoke simulation, it's actually disappeared. To bring it back, we need to open up the volumetrics tab and set the end frame to a higher value. Let's try 20. We can see it's still not enough, so let's go with a value of about 25. And then for the start frame, let's actually bring this higher until it matches the start of the simulation. Probably around 10 meters. If you want to play around with the color of the smoke, you can select the object, and in the node editor once again, you can change the color. For example, the explosion smoke should probably be a bit darker than the trail. So in the color, I might drag this down a little bit so we have a little bit of a darker color for the smoke. If you want a lighter color for the trail, just select it, select the domain, and set the color to a lighter color, or a darker color, whatever you like. You can even set it to a blue, green, or orange, or whatever color that you want. Another thing that you need to remember is to hide this flow object. Select it over here, and in the outliner, make sure it's hidden from the view and from the render as well. And there we go, that is basically it. From here you can add in some bloom to your scene, change up the lighting a little bit, you could even add in an HDR if you wanted to, and the cool thing about this is that it works in both Eevee and in Cycles. Here you can see the side-by-side comparison. Cycles does look a little bit better, but Eevee renders a bit faster. Keep in mind, if you do use Eevee, you're going to have to make sure that there are no glitches in the render. A lot of the time when I use volumetrics in Eevee, there's these random bright patches in some of the images after I render it out. And to fix that, all you need to do is just make sure you go into the folder, delete all the images, uncheck overwrite in the output tab, and then just click on render animation again. And it'll jump to those frames that have been deleted and then just re-render them. And that is it for this tutorial. Thank you very much for watching. If you created something cool, I would love to see it, so make sure to send it to me on Instagram at BlenderMadeEasy. But that is going to be it. Thanks again for watching, and thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and I will see you guys in the next one.